All right, hey everyone. So, are you ready for another deep dive? This time, we're looking at TikTok again. It's the gift that keeps on giving, right?
It's certainly been a wild ride.
Yeah. So, we've got this piece from rtve.ee, and it looks like there's been some pretty major developments in this whole US TikTok ban saga. I mean, remember, it was like ban on, ban off, maybe a deal. Where are we at now?
Well, as of right now, it seems like TikTok might be back on in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, but there are some pretty significant changes on the horizon that could completely reshape how the platform operates.
Wow. Okay, this is big. So let's rewind a bit for those who haven't been following every twist and turn. What was the initial situation that led to this whole ban in the first place?
Right. So initially, the U.S. Congress moved to ban TikTok.
And that was mainly due to security concerns.
Exactly. A lot of it stemmed from TikTok being owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, and there were serious concerns about potential security risks associated with that.
Yeah, I remember a lot of talk about data privacy and, what kind of access the Chinese government might have to user data.
Exactly. The core issue was data security. There were fears that the Chinese government could potentially gain access to all sorts of data from U.S. users through ByteDance. I mean, we're talking everything from personal information to browsing habits.
Even like location data.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in today's world, where data is increasingly seen as this valuable strategic asset, that's a major red flag for governments.
For sure. So basically, TikTok was staring down a full-blown ban in one of its biggest markets. I mean, millions of Americans use TikTok. So what was their response to all of this?
Well, they didn't just sit back and take it. In fact, they actually made a pretty bold move.
What did they do?
They ceased operations in the U.S.
Whoa, they completely shut down.
Yeah, it was a huge gamble, really. But it was a way to show just how disruptive a ban would be, not only to their users, but to the whole digital landscape.
That's pretty high stakes. It really puts the spotlight on the potential consequences of the ban. Now, wasn't it around this time that the Supreme Court got involved?
Yes, you're right. The Supreme Court ended up upholding the ban, which put even more pressure on TikTok. Things were looking pretty grim for them at that point.
So the ban's in place, the Supreme Court agrees with it. What happens next?
Well, this is where things take a really interesting turn. Former President Trump stepped in with this unexpected proposal.
He did. I mean, wasn't he the one who was all about banning TikTok in the first place?
Well, yeah, but it's actually even more complicated than that. The Biden administration had actually decided not to enforce the ban right away, leaving it for the incoming Trump administration to deal with.
Wow, so the Biden administration basically kicked the can down the road and made it Trump's problem.
Pretty much. And this is where the story gets really fascinating, particularly for you and our listeners, because it reveals a lot about the power dynamics at play.
Okay, so what did Trump propose? How was he planning to address these security concerns around TikTok?
He floated this idea of a joint venture where U.S. companies would own 50% of TikTok. He argued that this would ensure that the platform was, and I quote, in good hands.
In good hands. So essentially Americanizing TikTok to kind of mitigate those national security risks. But what was the real motivation behind that approach? Was it just about security?
Well, there were likely a number of factors at play. First of all, the potential economic benefits were huge. Trump himself claimed that TikTok could be worth, get this, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars. Bringing TikTok under partial U.S. ownership would mean a piece of that pie would stay within the U.S. economy.
Trillions. With a T. That's an insane amount of money.
Tell me, wasn't it also a political power play? I mean, Trump was known for being pretty tough on China.
Oh, absolutely. You can definitely see this move as a way to exert pressure on China and demonstrate American dominance in the tech world.
Yeah, forcing TikTok into this joint venture basically puts an American stamp on it.
Exactly. Trump was asserting American control over a Chinese company that had gained massive popularity and influence. So it wasn't just about data security, it was about economic power and who gets to control this piece of the digital world. So did this deal actually go through? Did TikTok get that reprieve?
Well, not quite. Trump did give them a deadline extension to iron out the details of this joint venture, so they got a temporary reprieve, which allowed them to restore service in the U.S., while those negotiations continued behind the scenes.
So that's why rtve.es is reporting that TikTok is back online in the U.S.
Exactly. But its long-term fate is still hanging in the balance.
It all comes down to this proposed deal.
Exactly. And there's no guarantee it'll actually succeed. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for TikTok and its users, but for the future of data privacy, global tech regulation, and the whole relationship between governments and these giant tech companies.
Man, you've really laid out just how complex the situation is. So where do we go from here? What happens if the deal goes through? What if it collapses?
Well, let's explore those scenarios next, because the ripple effects of this whole TikTok saga could be felt far beyond the platform itself. You know, it's true. The ripple effects of this whole thing could go way beyond just TikTok.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So let's say this deal actually goes through. What kind of ripple effects could we see?
Well, if it's finalized and TikTok operates under this new joint venture structure, it would set a pretty big precedent.
A precedent for?
For how the U.S. government approaches national security concerns related to foreign-owned tech companies. It could signal a real shift towards more scrutiny, maybe even more intervention.
In cases where data security is a concern.
Yeah, or anytime they perceive a threat from potential foreign influence.
That makes sense. It'd be like a blueprint for handling similar situations in the future.
But doesn't that also raise some concerns about, government overreach? Like, what about individual freedoms? Well, yeah, it is a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, governments definitely have a responsibility to protect their citizens' data and their national security interests, of course. But on the other hand, too much intervention could stifle innovation.
And limit the free flow of information.
Exactly. And those are pretty crucial for a thriving digital economy and, democratic society.
So there are valid arguments on both sides. But what if the deal falls apart? What happens then? What could the consequences be for TikTok and for the wider tech landscape even?
If the negotiations just break down completely and they can't reach a compromise, TikTok could be looking at a total ban in the U.S.
Wow.
Which would be a devastating blow to the platform, not to mention their users. And it would definitely have a huge impact on the whole digital ecosystem.
Yeah, it would be a massive loss for TikTok for sure. They've put a lot of resources into the U.S. market, built up this huge user base. But how would it affect other tech companies, especially ones that operate globally?
Well, a TikTok ban could embolden other governments to take similar actions, right?
Against foreign-owned tech companies.
Exactly. It could trigger all sorts of protectionist measures, maybe even data localization policies.
Right.
And that could lead to a much more fragmented internet, a less interconnected one.
It's like the internet could become this, divided space.
Right, divided along national lines, with data flowing less freely and innovation being held back by geopolitical tensions.
That's a pretty bleak picture. I mean, we rely on these platforms for everything these days, for news, for communication, for connecting with people. But hold on, let's not get too doom and gloom here. Couldn't this also lead to some positive changes?
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely a potential upside here.
Like what?
Well, if these tech companies are held to higher standards, right?
Because of the increased scrutiny.
Exactly. It could push them to prioritize data security and, implement stricter content moderation policies, be more transparent about how their algorithms work. All of that could actually lead to, a reduction in misinformation and hate speech and harassment online.
So the internet could become a safer place, a more trustworthy environment.
Potentially, yes.
So it's like a trade-off then. More regulation could limit certain freedoms, but it could also create a more responsible, more ethical digital world.
It really is. It's this complex equation, and there are no easy answers.
It's a tough one. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think ultimately it's a decision that we have to make together as a society. We need to have these open and honest conversations about, what kind of internet we want, what values are most important to us, and how do we find that balance between security and privacy and freedom in the digital age?
It's a big question, and honestly, the TikTok case has really brought these issues to the forefront. It's become this focal point for this much bigger debate about the power of tech giants, the role of governments, and the future of the internet itself.
And that's precisely why this deep dive is so important for you, for our listeners. It's not just about understanding this one specific situation with TikTok.
It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about understanding these broader trends that are shaping the entire digital world, and they're not going away.
And we all need to stay informed.
Absolutely. Stay informed, stay engaged, because these issues are going to continue to evolve, and we all have a role to play in shaping the future of the internet.
You've really painted a clear picture of how complex and how consequential this TikTok situation is. But before we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. This isn't just some, abstract geopolitical thing happening in some far-off corner of the world. This has real implications for how you use the internet and how your data is being handled.
You're absolutely right. We've talked about the potential impact on data privacy, on freedom of expression, but let's zoom in a bit, get a little more personal, and explore how this could affect you directly.
Yeah, let's shift our focus and talk about the personal side of things. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, governments, the tech industry, all that. But let's get down to brass tacks. How could this TikTok situation actually affect you, the listener? Like your online experience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the most immediate impacts, I think, could be on the apps and services that you use every day. If this trend towards greater government scrutiny keeps going, we might see more and more platforms being forced to adapt their data practices or even face restrictions in certain countries.
So it wouldn't just be TikTok.
Right, exactly. It could be other social media platforms, messaging apps, even online gaming platforms.
It's a domino effect.
Yeah, pretty much. This whole thing really highlights how interconnected the digital world is. One event can have these ripple effects across the entire ecosystem.
So what kinds of changes are we talking about? Like what could actually change for users?
Well, it could mean changes to the features that you enjoy, for example. Maybe even limitations on who you can connect with online.
That's a big deal. And what about the content we see online? How could that be affected?
Right. So if governments start having more control over these platforms, it could lead to more censorship or filtering of content.
So we might not be able to access certain information.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. It could limit your access to a range of things, actually. Information, different perspectives, even entertainment. You might find it harder to access content that's critical of governments or that challenges, the mainstream narratives.
Okay, that's a little unsettling, to be honest. It makes you wonder about the future of a free and open internet. I mean, we depend on these platforms for so much these days. News, communication, staying in touch with people, sharing culture.
Absolutely. It's something to think about for sure.
But hold on, couldn't there be some positive outcomes too? I mean, couldn't all of this actually lead to a safer online environment? A more trustworthy one?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. If these tech companies are held to higher standards, right?
Because of the increased scrutiny.
Exactly. They might start prioritizing data security more, put in place stricter content moderation policies, be more transparent about how those algorithms work. All of that could lead to a reduction in things like misinformation, hate speech, online harassment.
So maybe the internet could become a more positive space overall, more inclusive, safer for everyone.
Potentially, yes.
So it's kind of a trade-off then, right? More regulation might mean some limitations on certain freedoms, but it could also make the digital world more responsible, more ethical.
It really is. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's a decision that we have to make as a society. We need to have those conversations about what kind of internet we want to see, what values are most important to us.
Yeah, and how do we balance all of these different things? Security, privacy, freedom in the digital age. It's a lot to consider.
It is. It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And the TikTok case has really brought it all into focus.
For sure. It's a flashpoint for this much bigger conversation about the power of these tech giants, the role of governments, what the future of the internet is going to look like.
And that's why I think this deep dive has been so valuable. It's not just about understanding the specifics of this one situation.
It's about understanding the bigger trends, the forces that are shaping the digital world.
Exactly. These issues are going to keep evolving, so it's so important to stay informed and stay engaged.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the initial ban, Trump's intervention, the potential ripple effects, all those big questions about security, privacy, freedom online. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you some insights, some context to help you navigate this crazy digital landscape.
The next time you open TikTok or any social media app, think about what's going on behind the scenes.
Right. It's not just a simple interface. There's this whole world of politics and economics, ethical considerations, all happening behind it.
Your actions, your choices, they matter. They're shaping the future of the digital world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We'll definitely keep following this story as it develops, and we hope you'll stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged too. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the TikTok saga. We'll catch you next time.